All right, if you would, there is, you should have gotten this outline or this little form. What I'm asking for basically is this. I've given you a little list at the top of the subjects we're continuing on. We're about to wrap things up. But if there's any other subjects that haven't been covered for apologetics that you would like to have covered, please write it down and give me that sheet. If you have any questions for our Q&A day, okay, please write those down. You'll notice one thing that's missing from this form, a place to put your name. You don't have to put your name, okay? I had one person come up to me and say, I'm glad I don't have to have my name there because I'm afraid I'm asking a stupid question. And that way, at least nobody else will know I'm the one who asked it. Okay, I don't do handwriting analysis to figure out who wrote what, okay? It's not an issue. If you have any questions, please put those down. I've had, I think, 3 different people now talk to me about the fact they've got fossils at home, and they've said, should we bring them in? Let me just say this now. If you have fossils and you are willing to bring them in, and I'm not talking about your spouse, okay? If you have fossils and you're willing to bring them in, we're going to do that on our Q&A day. So whenever the Q&A day is, I will have tables set up, be able to bring them in. People will be able to take a look at them. I think it'll be great to see them. We can talk a little bit more about them, or then one of the questions may come in, exactly how are fossils formed and why aren't they being formed today like they were before, for whatever reason. So anyway, if you have any questions, and then at the bottom, we are, as is my custom, anytime we step away from going through a book of the Bible and we hit a subject like we have done with apologetics, the next thing I do is always go back and we work through a book of the Bible expositionally. And so if you have any suggestions for what book you would like us to go to next, please put those down. Just fill out however much or as little as you want. And then if you would just let me have, if you could just give me those once you're done with those, that'll give me some good guidance for the next few weeks. Yes. No, they can be any questions. I'm not going to do that. So if any questions you have, because I'll get questions through email. For example, have you ever heard of this person or this ministry? What do you think of them? Those kinds of things. Anything like that is fine. Yes. So yes, put those down. And if I get a bunch of questions and we take 2 weeks, we take 2 weeks. I'm fine with that. So that'd be great. So we're going to do that. All right. So today we're going to kind of wrap up the whole subject of the flood, and we're going to be talking about the Ice Age today. One of the things that's interesting, I just saw an article that they were discovered many, many years ago. You may have heard this. Around 2012, I believe it was, in a Chilean desert, there were discovered the fossils of 80 baleen whales. And it stumped, it just stumped scientists. How could 80 baleen whales end up in the middle of a desert? Many of them totally preserved. I mean, the entire skeleton preserved. The fossils were there. And of course, one of the first assumptions that was made was, well, these occurred over long periods of time. The problem with that theory is that many of them are actually lying one across the other. And so it would not work for them to be, to say that there were hundreds of millions of years between this or millions of years between this or whatever. But what is interesting is we have an answer. Okay, we have an answer to exactly how that happened. As the floodwaters are dissipating, these whales are trapped in an area where they can't get out. The waters are flowing out, but they're in this bowl. They're down low enough. They can't get out. What happens? They go down with the water. They all end up together. And as it dries, it's quickly covered. You have perfect explanation for how those are there. One of the things that scientists, non-biblical scientists, face is they have an assumption that greatly works against them. Many of you may have heard of this. It's called uniformitarianism. It's probably the longest word I use in any kind of real sense. But anyway, the idea of uniformitarianism is this. The things that we see happening today that's how it has always happened. One scientist coined it this way: the present is the key to the past. And so that's the statement. Well, the fact is, if you believe in uniformitarianism, if you hold that position, you can't believe in a global flood because that was a one-time event. There is, by the way, there is no scientific basis for uniformitarianism. None at all. The reason for it is it fits their worldview. They use it as something that is established as true so that they can then say, since things have always been this way, and anything they don't want to be a different way, they can just simply say, well, that couldn't have happened because we believe in uniformitarianism. Well, they can explain the ice age occurring over time because they say there are multiple ice ages. In fact, some say up to 50 or 60 ice ages. It's a regular event. So that's the way they said. And by the way, I looked it up. You asked last week about sedimentary rock up on the mountaintops. It's there. They have found it. Yes.
So then,
okay.
That's applied not only to things on Earth, but the cosmos.
Well, it's applied to creation. Yeah, the question was, it's applied not just to Earth. Yes. Uniformitarianism. Things are, of course, the Big Bang, quote unquote, would violate that, but they say that's the exception. You know, things that are in place, that happened. But once things got stabilized and once things were done being created, although they're not being done created because evolution is occurring, uniformitarianism takes an impact.
I mean, because regarding, the age of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
one of the arguments for the whole universe is speed of light. And they said, and they're assuming it's always been the same.
Okay, hold that thought. One of the ideas concerning one of the arguments that's used to say we have an old Earth, an old creation, is the speed of light. If you will notice on the list I handed out, one of the topics that we're covering, in fact, I think it's in 2 weeks, difficult questions for creationists. The speed of light and the dating of rocks are two of the big ones right there. So I'm going to put you on hold for 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about how do we as young Earth Christians, how would we approach the idea, well, what about the speed of light? And what about seeing things that are millions of light years away or something like that? So we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. Jason Lyle, who is an astrophysicist, young Earth creationist, he was at Answers in Genesis. I think he's at ICR now, but anyway, he may be independent. He has a very interesting theory. Okay, this is a teaser. Come back in 2 weeks to find out. All right. So we have this idea of uniformitarianism. The reason I bring that up is because when we look at the Ice Age, and we're going to talk about, I'm just going to get as far as I can today and then wrap it up. I've got a few things, but we're going to start with the Ice Age. Was there an Ice Age? A lot of Christians, if you ask them, was there an Ice Age? They're going to say, no, there wasn't. And the reason they say, no, there wasn't, isn't because there isn't any scientific evidence for it or anything like that. It's because everyone associates the Ice Age as having happened millions of years ago. I don't believe in millions of years. Therefore, the Ice Age could not have occurred. That's the reasoning. That's faulty reasoning. Okay, the fact is, when you say Ice Age has occurred millions of years, you're already giving credence to, you're already basically assuming that that's a fact. And it isn't. Okay, was there an Ice Age? If you look around geologically, and geographically, especially in the Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, those areas, you're going to see evidence of an Ice Age. Okay, the moraines and things like that. And so the question is, really the question is not, did an Ice Age occur? There's just too much evidence to say, yes, there is. Question is, how did it occur? What's interesting is if you ask most scientists this, they can't give you an answer. And I think I gave you this quote in the notes. I'm just going to read it. In 1997, U.S. News and World Report described the Ice Age, the creation of the Ice Age or Ice Ages, as one of the great mysteries of science, stating, yet despite the efforts of marine geologists, atmospheric chemists, oceanographers, and more, no one knows what causes the Ice Age. And then here's a direct quote. We've been chewing on this problem for 30 or 40 years, says Alan Mix, an oceanographer at Oregon State University. It's a killer. Adds Ralph Cicerone, Dean of the Physical Sciences at the University of California, Irvine. It's embarrassing. Secular scientists cannot determine how the ice ages occurred. And what happens is it's quote unquote controversial. They can't come up with a solution. They're continually proposing new explanations. And by the way, when scientists are proposing new explanations, that's a flag right there to let you know they don't have a clue as to what's going on. And they're just trying to come up with something that, and by the way, I'm not trying to be dismissive about this, but we've got to understand our thinking and their thinking. Normally when that's happening, they're trying to find a solution that fits their worldview. They're trying to find a solution that fits the millions and millions and billions of years. Okay, and what's happening is there are certain things you look at and there's no legitimate or solid explanation for it. It's interesting, the one that's being held most today as far as the theory, it's called the astronomical, or it's called the Milankovitch ice age theory. And basically what it says is light, over a long period of time, less sunlight was hitting the earth, and therefore it caused things to cool and therefore resulted in an ice age. But even this, which is the one that's most widely held, scientists have shot holes in it. So they don't have it. Here's the problem you have. Yes. What's that? More sun got through. What they're saying is the sun itself goes through cycles of burning hotter or not burning hotter. And that is true. That is true. It's never been to the extent that would need to occur for an ice age to occur, but that is true. Oh, you are such a... Yeah, I know. That goes back to the whole other line. Yes. Are there any climate change deniers in here? No, we all acknowledge the climate changes. We just don't necessarily acknowledge it's the reason you think it is. Yes, the sun does go through phases where it burns a little hotter, burns a little cooler, and that obviously affects the earth. So yes, following that line.
They say, well, if man caused what caused it millions of years ago when the ice age went away, did man cause that too?
Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, that's what you will find. Most environmental things are greatly politicized and used for political gain and oftentimes economic gain. So it's the way it is. So what we have, but if you think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's just talk about Colorado. Most of you have been here long enough. When do the heaviest snows normally fall? March, April, spring. Why? Because you have a large amount of moist air coming up from the south with the cold air that hits it. Now, during our times of greatest snowfall, what is normally the temperature? 15, 20, yeah, 15, teens or 20s. It's usually not 30 below. When it's 30 below, it's usually very clear, okay? And there's no moisture in the air because it is so cold. So if the earth, think this through with me a little bit, if the earth gets cooler and cooler, how much moisture is there in the air? Less and less. So where is all that snow going to come from for this ice age? You see, the secular thinking on this doesn't make sense with the way the world works. To get a heavy amount of snow in a short amount of time to create an ice age, you need a lot of moisture with cooler temperatures. Now, the question is there a time in the Earth's history when we have seen a lot of moisture in the air, but suddenly cooler temperatures that caused a great amount of snowfall? And the global flood is the perfect platform for that. Okay, you have all this water that's been on the earth. So it's going to be very humid to begin with. But remember, there is a lot of volcanic activity. It is estimated that and by the way, these kinds of analyses have been run on computers, not just based on biblical, but computers, what would happen if there was a global flood and then the water's released back down into the reserves, the reservoirs where the water is now? You would have a great amount of movement, tectonic movement. You'd have a great amount of volcanic activity. You would have a great amount of lava flows, magma displacement, things like that. Almost every model shows that the water temperature, now this is going to sound contrarian, but it makes sense. The water temperature of the oceans would increase by probably 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Now, immediately you're saying, wait a minute, how can you have warmer oceans with an ice age? Keep going through. Warmer oceans are going to dramatically increase the amount of moisture in the air because warmer water evaporates faster than colder water. You can get into the science of how the molecules move and all that. We won't worry about that. Warmer, you have greater evaporation. You have much more moisture in the air. At the same time, what is happening with all these volcanoes? They are spewing out all of this ash and sediment that is in the air. I don't know if you remember this is about 20 years ago now. I remember we were in Lithuania when there was a large volcanic eruption from an Icelandic volcano. And just one volcano lowered the average temperature in Europe, just a couple of degrees, but it was one volcano. Planes had to fly thousands of miles out of the way so they didn't fly through the soot cloud. And it had a great impact for a long time. That's one volcano. Imagine hundreds of volcanoes throughout the world. So what you have now, warm ocean water, lots of moisture in the air. There is an envelope of ash and soot blocking the sun. What's going to happen to the temperature of the Earth, the atmospheric temperature? It's going to drop and drop quickly. Now you have all this moisture in the air, cold temperatures. You've got snow and snow and snow. It stays cold. Probably it lasted a few hundred years. Okay, the total impact, yes. Exactly. It happened at both poles. It did not happen. The ice age did not reach the equator. Okay, it did not reach down that far. Basically, you see it down to about the southern point of Minnesota in the northern hemisphere. Okay, and it's about that latitude in Europe as well. Got down to about that point. No, the entire world was not enveloped. But the ice age occurred. Now, no, this is the biblical view. It occurred that secular agrees with that. Nobody believes, no one secular or biblical believes that the ice age covered the entire world. Didn't do that. It came from both poles. Came basically about a third of the way to the equator, roughly. Third to half, depending on where you are. Yes. I believe the continents were already formed through the waters receding from the flood. I think that is what caused the tectonic movement. So I believe they were probably already in place during the ice age, which also would explain why we see the mountains and we see the terrain as it is, and we see the evidences of the ice age, the moraines and things like that, why we see all that in the present topography. So I believe it happened before the ice age. I think the ice age occurred right at the end of the flood, and for a few hundred years probably after the flood, it continued. And so what we have is you need three things. You need warmer water in the oceans. You need the increased evaporation, which comes from the warmer water, and you need all of them, the aerosols, all of those things that are in the air. You have all three of those, you've got yourself an ice age. It's exactly what we have with the flood. Now, what's interesting is when you talk about the ice age, a number of people, the scientists, it's interesting because one of the biggest problems secular scientists have is trying to explain an ice age. And their problems would go away is if they accepted the warmer ocean temperatures. But they can't accept the warmer ocean temperatures because to do that would require a cataclysmic event, which would be outside the bounds of uniformitarianism. So you see what happens is secular scientists get trapped into a certain way of thinking because they have to follow a certain worldview. And then because of that, they have to go down a path of falsehood and try to figure out how to make it sound right. Now, we can do the same thing. If we get into the scriptures and we misinterpret scripture the way we want it to be, not the way it actually is, we can do the same thing. So it's not limited to secularists. But in this case, what's happening is secular scientists hold to a uniformitarianism view, so therefore they cannot allow for a great flood, a global flood. If you can't allow for a global flood and the subsequent tectonic activity that occurs when the water recedes, you don't have an explanation for how the water temperature grew. But we have that explanation perfectly. Now, what's interesting is not only does this uniformitarianism view stop them, but then it causes other problems for them, things that we can explain. Here's an interesting application. And this is why I wanted to bring this I thought this was a very interesting application. But I wanted to bring this in because I wanted to show how it's so important that we have the right worldview, because a biblical worldview will allow us to explain everything because it's based in God's word. And it's only when we deviate from scripture that we run into a problem. You have heard in Russia, in other places up north, they have found the skeletons and sometimes frozen bodies of woolly mammoths. Okay. What is the best explanation for woolly mammoths and then their extinction? The best explanation for woolly mammoths is not a gradual ice age that occurred because temperatures in Siberia right now are minus 40. There are no woolly mammoths running around. Okay? Not much is going to survive at minus 40 for any length of time. But in the secular view of an ice age, that's exactly what would have occurred. In a biblical view of an ice age, you don't have minus 40 there. Like we just talked about, when do the heaviest snows come? Yeah, it's in the teens or 20s. Very, 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 it's an atmosphere in which the woolly mammoths would be able to live. And by the way, if it was minus 40, it wouldn't just be the woolly mammoths that would be having trouble. It would be all of the food, all of the plants that they need for food would not be there either. So there's no explanation. There's no way to justify from a purely secular viewpoint how woolly mammoths could survive in Siberia through the winter. But if the temperatures are in the teens and 20s and the snowfall comes quickly, there's still plant life, there's still things like that. Now, yeah, I mean, the plants would be dormant, but you look out, I mean, we've been through temperatures like that, and you look, there's grass outside. Yeah, it's brown, but it's there, things like that. Those temperatures allow for that to continue. Now, they would be in hibernation, but the plants would still be there because it hadn't been that cold. So what happens? They would be in existence, they would be up there, they would be eating, and the ice age occurs. Okay, well, what happens? They would be there, they would be able to make it, but then what happens at the end of the ice age? Because remember, keep in mind, during the ice age, there's probably no Arctic ice. The water temperature has risen in the sea. There's probably very little ice in the sea. And so the temperatures are mitigated by that. Now there's still snow, because just like we see here, it'll snow a foot and a half, 2 feet, and it'll be 20, 25 degrees out, even 30. So you're getting all this snow, but but the water temperatures are mitigating. So you have that. Well, what happens at the end of the ice age? Okay, at the end of the ice age, then the water temperatures are cooling over time. They finally cool back to a normal state. The ice then forms on the Arctic Ocean and others, and the temperature drops. The woolly mammals then are not able to continue to live because the temperature's dropping. So what happens? They die. Models have shown at the end of an ice age like this, when you get the ice covering, that it becomes a very barren and desert, almost like a desert-like place until during its transitional time. A lot of dust and snow, a lot of dust and things blowing, covering the bodies of the woolly mammoths. It's interesting because in almost all cases, these fossils are being found in frozen hills called loesses that are they're basically dirt covered. They're covered by dirt, and they've been preserved for that reason. the modeling of a global flood and the end of the ice age describes perfectly what would have happened to the woolly mammoths. Now, it's a theory. Am I going to stand up here and say this is definitely what happened? No, I can't. And as creationists, we need to be very careful that we don't declare something to be true just because it makes the most sense. But we have the best evidence we have is that this would describe how that happened. Oh, well, before the Ice Age, they were in existence. I mean, they were in existence before the Ice Age started. You mean after they came off the Ark? Well, I mean, they probably for 100 years after the Ark, this Ice Age is building. But God is replenishing the earth through everything that was on the Ark. I believe at that time there was rapid repopulation of animals. Okay, probably in a supernatural way. And so it was happening much more quickly. But you had two of every kind. And so, were there 2 woolly mammoths and 2 elephants? Are they considered different? Are they considered the same? I don't know the answer to that. But they headed up there. Yeah. I mean, I don't think they interbreed. So if they don't interbreed, they'd have to be different. In that case, right. But you send a couple of woolly mammoths north and God blesses and allows them to reproduce maybe more quickly than normal during a short period of time afterwards, they're going to be there. So, we know that what God, it's interesting because after the flood, what did God say to do? Go out and repopulate the earth. And by the way, one of the reasons, this is a side note, but one of the reasons that God went down to the Tower of Babel and confused the languages is because they did exactly what God told them not to do. They all stayed in one place. And God said, no, I want you to repopulate the earth. And so he confused the languages and they all went their own way. So that worked that way. So I believe if God told man to do that, he did that with the animals as well. So they were on the ark and then they reproduced. Yes. Yeah. I mean, and we see mammoth and dinosaur in Montana and Colorado. There's mammoth remains here too. Yeah, you go far enough north on latitude, you're going to find it. You're going to find them because that was, now how all that happened right after the flood, I don't know. I just know it happened. Exactly. Yeah, several of them we don't know. The ones that are being found in Siberia, I would definitely say are the Ice Age. And the reason I say that is because they're buried in a different way. They're not buried in the sedimentary rock. They're buried in these mounds of dirt. So in some cases we can say with a lot of certainty, this is the way that would happen. Okay, but in some, exactly, some would be as a result of the flood, and some wouldn't. Yes, and in some cases it could be one or the other. We don't know, but we do know the flood explains it. We do know the global flood absolutely explains it. Now, I've got listed in there, and we're going to go through this real quickly because we're running out of time. A lot of people have said, well, there's no global flood. There are all around the world, there are numbers of cultures that have flood traditions. If a global flood didn't happen, where did all these traditions come from? Now, it's not a strong argument, okay? But it is an argument. Now, what's interesting is there's one in particular called the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? And what a lot of people say is the biblical account of the flood is actually taken from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, I'm gonna talk about this real quickly, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is a story. It's never presented to be a true story. It is a legend. But it's interesting, if you look through it, first of all, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ark is a cube, 120 cubits, all directions, okay? Now, just think about the seaworthiness of a cube. Okay, you can't think about it because there is none. Okay, it's going to roll all over the place. Who's ever inside is not going to make it very long. Okay, their main character, I always have trouble saying this, Utnapishtim, he's the Babylonian Noah figure in all this, was told to build this. He built it in 7 days, 120 cubits each way, built it in 7 days, and during that time, he also collected all the animals that he needed. Okay, that's all part of this story. The flood covered the world in 7 days. Okay, so all of that is very interesting. But there is a problem. You have a lot of inconsistencies in the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The gods that brought the flood, they depended on the sacrifices offered by humans to survive. They ate the sacrifices. What happened to the sacrifices when there were no more humans other than Utnapishtim? Okay, the gods all went on a long-term diet. And so and there's that and a number of inconsistencies point to the fact that the Epic of Gilgamesh is just a legend. It's not based in any kind of reality, cannot be, as you get to know it. Now, another one that is a little more difficult, if you turn to Psalm 104, Pastor went through this psalm, but there's just a couple things I want to point out real quick. It was interesting. Somebody was mentioning this morning beforehand about Ken Ham, talking about Ken Ham and what he's, and they made a very interesting and a very true statement. Much of the opposition to Ken Ham comes from other Christians. Okay, and that's very true. Okay, Psalm 104 is a psalm that talks about creation, but it talks about the flood. And there are Christians who hold to an old earth position. One of the more famous ones is Hugh Ross. And I mention him by name because he's put a lot of material out there. I've seen a lot of the material. He says that Psalm 104 is about creation. And because it's about creation, there are things in Psalm 104. For example, in verse 29, thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die. Now, he says this is about creation. So he says, look, death was occurring before Genesis 1. Okay, that's his argument, because Psalm 104 is about creation, one of his arguments. He says it's obviously that animals were eating. Verse 21, the young lions roar after their prey and seek their meat from God. So this was going on before creation, and so he says, and they use the day-age theory or the gap theory or whatever. But the argument is that Psalm 104, because it's a creation psalm, shows that there was death and there were all these things going on before, the day 6 when God said it was good. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Pastor spent some time, but I want to point out a couple things. If you read this carefully, notice verse 16. The trees of the Lord are full of sap, the cedars of Lebanon, which he hath planted. Show me in Genesis 1 where Lebanon is. Nowhere had been named. There was no Lebanon. There was nothing. So if this is part of creation, how is that being mentioned? Verse 26. There go the ships. Ships? In Genesis 1? Psalm 35. Let the sinners be consumed out of the earth. I don't see any sinners in Genesis 1. Most of this psalm is the psalmist looking at the way things are, the way they are now. Now is, from his point of view, the way they were when he wrote this. Yes, he is referring to the creation week. He is referring back to it. But he is also talking about the flood. Verses 6 through 9, you know what? You could interpret that a couple of different ways depending on how you look at the Hebrew grammar. But you can't say that this is a creation psalm when it mentions Lebanon, when it mentions ships, when it mentions things like that. And so we have to be very careful because, people from, Christians can take scripture like this and make it sound very convincing. So we have to be very careful that we're reading that correctly. You have a little chart. I did not have the time to check this out, but I found it. I thought it was very interesting. It shows the genealogy basically from Adam to Noah, the meaning. And when you read through the meaning, it's very interesting because it's essentially talking about the flood that is to come, the judgment, and the coming of the Savior. So it's an interesting thing. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to check it out, so I want to hold off on that. But it came from what I would consider a reputable source. One last question I just want to take for a minute or so, and then we're going to wrap it up. One of the other things that the flood answers to some degree is, where did the dinosaurs go? Now, I'm not going to elaborate this, but supposedly they were basically wiped out by a large meteor that hit down in Mexico. That meteor would have hit and probably would have wiped out about 95% of all life. Then with all of the activity, the volcanic activity, I mean, can you imagine a meteor 6 miles across hitting the Earth at like 45,000 miles an hour, 20 times faster than a bullet? It's going to cause worldwide catastrophe. Basically, with everything, I'm not going to go into all the details, but scientists have shown that with everything that happens, they believe probably almost all life was wiped out. So they say this, but here's the interesting second aspect of that. There are at least 5 other meteor strikes at least that size. That Earth. If a meteor hitting the Earth caused all that damage, that means life would have been removed and had to start again 6 different times. It didn't do it 1 time. How's it going to do it 6 times? Okay, there are so many. The meteor hitting the Earth is not a valid reason why the dinosaurs are gone, but somehow enough of other life kept. As one scientist, as a secular scientist described it, it would have created essentially a nuclear winter. Basically, nothing would have survived, or very little would have survived. And so I just present that because that's often one other thing. Yes, and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, are we saying from a biblical perspective there were no meteor strikes? No, we're not saying that at all. What we're saying is the meteor strikes didn't cause the death of the dinosaurs. Okay. If they happened during the flood, if they happened as part of the initial part of the flood or anything like that, they would be there. Or if they happened right after the flood, they would be there, but it probably would not have the same impact that scientists say it has. And the reason I say that is because scientists are basing their projections on, they had to come up with a way to get rid of the dinosaurs. And so they use that as a reason for it. So it would, right. So yes, real quick, I got to wrap things up. Meteors are a cataclysmic event. Well, I guess because we have a whole bunch of close calls and a few that were closer than that. I don't know. That's, it's interesting. In uniformitarianism, everything works the same unless we need it to work differently. It's pretty much how it works. So you've got to get all the details here, Jerry, okay? So anyway, so I wanted to wrap that up and just mention that, because sometimes people will say, well, what about the meteor strikes and all that? There's no evidence that the meteor strikes had anything to do with the dinosaurs. The flood is definitely the explanation for that. Let's pray.